Imagine waking up in the middle of the night to the sound of planes tearing through the sky, but no one told you that a war was happening. No announcement, no official statement, no explanation. Just explosions, fire, and death falling from the sky. Now imagine that this didn't happen in declared enemy territory, but in a country that officially wasn't even at war with the attacker. Sounds impossible? Well, it happened. And for years, it was kept secret. During the Vietnam War, while the world watched the conflict being broadcast on television, another war, much quieter and more obscure, was taking place in the shadows. A massive, systematic, and extremely destructive military campaign was being conducted far from the eyes of the press, far from public debate, and far from the consciousness of most people. The stage for this secret operation: Cambodia. But here's the point that changes everything. Cambodia was officially neutral. It wasn't a declared enemy country. There was no public approval for large-scale attacks. Yet what happened there was one of the most intense bombing campaigns in modern history. And for a long time, nobody outside a small circle within the government knew about it. How was this possible? How could an operation of this scale exist without the public knowing? The answer lies in closed rooms, decisions made away from the spotlight, and a carefully structured system to hide the truth. Altered reports, manipulated records, orders transmitted through parallel channels, all to ensure that what was happening simply didn't appear where it should have. Meanwhile, on the ground, the reality was brutal. Entire villages were being hit without warning. Families were disappearing in seconds, and people never understood why they were being attacked. There was no clear front line, no visible enemy, only destruction falling from the sky repeatedly. But perhaps the most disturbing thing is not just what happened, but the fact that it wasn't a mistake. It wasn't an isolated accident. It was a planned decision, executed and, above all, hidden. And this is where the story starts to get even more unsettling. Because as documents began to emerge years later, it became clear that what was told to the public at the time was not only incomplete. It was, in many cases, deliberately false. Who knew? Who authorized it? And why did all of this need to remain hidden at all costs? Because what really happened in Cambodia wasn't just a military operation. It was one of the biggest cover-ups in modern history. And what's most unsettling is that, even today, many details remain fragmented, hidden in archives, incomplete testimonies, and conflicting versions. Each new revelation raises more questions than answers, and the more one investigates, the more evident it becomes that the complete truth may never have been officially admitted, leaving a historical void that is difficult to ignore for future generations who are still trying to understand it. To understand how all this began, we need to go back to a critical moment in the Vietnam War. When the United States faced a problem it couldn't publicly admit. Enemy troops didn't respect borders. North Vietnam used neighboring territories, especially within Cambodia, as strategic routes and support bases. Officially, Cambodia remained neutral, but in practice, the war had already crossed its borders long before any announcement. Inside the White House, the pressure was mounting. There was a dilemma. Allowing these routes to continue operating meant prolonging the war and increasing American losses. But openly attacking Cambodia would create an immediate international crisis. It would be seen as a clear violation of sovereignty, something politically explosive, both on the global stage and within the United States itself, where public opinion was already beginning to turn against the war. It was in this context that a decision emerged that would change everything. In 1969, under the administration of Richard Nixon, a secret operation began to take shape. The plan was simple in theory, but deeply controversial in practice: to bomb targets inside Cambodia without ever officially admitting that it was happening. This campaign was given a code name, Operation Menu, but the real secret wasn't just in the attacks themselves, but in how they were hidden. To prevent any kind of leak, a parallel communication system was created. Orders did not go through conventional military channels. Official reports were deliberately altered. Pilots received real coordinates to attack Cambodia, but the records indicated that the bombings were occurring within Vietnam. In other words, a completely different reality was presented in the official documents. Very few people knew the true extent of the operation. Even within the government, access was extremely limited. The objective was clear: to maintain total control of the narrative and prevent any information from reaching the press or the public. Meanwhile, in the sky, B-52 bombers carried out massive attacks, dropping tons of explosives on entire regions. On paper, none of this existed. No war in Cambodia, no air campaign, just silence. But this silence began to generate unexpected consequences, because the more the operation expanded, the harder it became to hide it completely. Small signs began to emerge: isolated reports, suspicions within the military system itself, and slowly cracks began to appear in this structure of absolute secrecy. And when those cracks finally began to open, something even more dangerous came into play. People within the system itself began to question orders, notice inconsistencies, and, in some cases, decide that this could no longer be hidden. The problem is that from that moment on, it was no longer just about a secret operation. It was about who would have the courage to expose the truth, and who would do anything to stop it. Initially, they were just suspicions, minor inconsistencies that few dared to question. But in highly controlled systems, even the smallest details out of place can reveal something much bigger. And that is exactly what began to happen within the very military and administrative structures of the United States. Analysts began noticing discrepancies between flight reports and official records. Coordinates didn't match. Seemingly routine missions showed strange patterns. Some information simply didn't make sense. But questioning these flaws wasn't easy. There was a clear atmosphere of silence, as if certain questions shouldn't even be asked. That's when one of the most important pieces of this story entered the scene: Daniel Ellsberg. Ellsberg was no outsider. He was part of the system. He worked directly on strategic war analysis and had access to highly classified documents. What he began to see was not just troubling, it was deeply disturbing. It wasn't just about questionable military decisions, but about an entire structure built to conceal the truth, not only from the public, but also from parts of the government itself. The documents he would later help expose, known as the Pentagon Papers, revealed a consistent pattern: information being manipulated, reports being adjusted, and a narrative carefully crafted to appear very different from reality. But what made everything even more serious was the real impact of these decisions on the ground. In Cambodia, the bombings continued, without warning, without public justification, without any form of transparency. Entire communities were affected, often without even understanding who was attacking or why. The war, which officially did not exist in that territory, was in practice devastating. And here comes one of the most controversial points in this whole story. Some analysts and historians argue that these secret bombings not only caused immediate destruction but also contributed to completely destabilizing the region. The political and social vacuum created by years of invisible attacks would have opened space for the growth of extremist forces within the country. Among these forces was the Khmer Rouge, a group that would later seize power and lead one of the most brutal regimes of the 20th century. This raises a troubling question: to what extent can decisions made in secret, away from the public eye, generate consequences that go far beyond what was originally planned? But perhaps the most tense moment in this story wasn't what happened on the battlefield. Yes, that was the moment when the truth began to slip away. Because when documents started being leaked, when journalists started investigating, when names started appearing, something changed within the system itself, and the carefully maintained silence began to crumble, irreversibly. The system that had been created to hide everything went into full defense mode, and it was at that moment that the story ceased to be just about a secret. War, and it turned into something even more dangerous, a direct confrontation between truth and power. When the truth finally began to emerge, it wasn't in a controlled manner. There was no official announcement, no transparent admission. What happened was far more chaotic. Leaks, investigations, unexpected headlines, and suddenly what had been carefully hidden began to appear before the public. Journalists began connecting the dots. Secret reports came to light, and names that had previously operated in the shadows became directly associated with the decisions that had kept that invisible war alive for years. Among those names was Henry Kissinger, a central figure in the strategies of the time and a key player in the decisions that allowed all of that to happen without immediate public knowledge. But even when the truth began to emerge, it didn't come out complete. Important parts remained hidden. Documents remained classified. Official statements were carefully worded to minimize political damage. And what reached the public was only a fraction of what had actually happened. Still, the impact was devastating. Trust in the government suffered a profound blow. The perception that decisions of this magnitude could be made in secret without real public oversight generated a level of distrust that resonates to this day. Because if something like this could happen once, what would prevent it from happening again? But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of this story lies not only in the political decisions or the hidden documents, and yes, in the human consequences that persisted for decades. In Cambodia, the effects of these bombings did not disappear with the end of the operation. Entire regions were left scarred. Communities were destroyed, and a country that was already under pressure ended up being pushed even further into a scenario of extreme instability. This instability, as many point out, paved the way for even more tragic events in the following years. And that brings us to the most uncomfortable point of this whole story. Because when we look back, we're not just analyzing a covert operation or a strategic mistake. We're observing a system that was able to conceal actions of enormous global impact while maintaining a completely different narrative for the world, and that changes everything. It changes the way we understand political decisions. It changes the way we view international conflicts. And most importantly, it raises a question that remains without a clear answer to this day. How many other stories like this never reached the public? And perhaps the most unsettling thing is realizing that many of these answers may still be hidden, waiting for the right moment to emerge, or perhaps they will never be fully revealed. If you want to continue exploring stories like this, where what was hidden is often more important than what was revealed, consider subscribing to the channel, because here, each video is an invitation to look beyond the surface and to question what really happened.